clear about its attachment, whether this modification of cranial dura are present. So we'll be studying about the dural venous sinus, which is actually a venous space situated between what are different layers of dura. We are talking about the cranial dura. What are two layers of cranial dura? What are the layers of cranial dura? What are the layers of cranial dura? You need to speak out.
Industrial layer and meningeal layer.
Sorry?
Industrial
layer and meningeal layer. Okay? So this almost all the dural venous sinuses are present between the two cranial dura, that is between industrial layer and meningeal layer of dura. But there are some exceptions, like this inferior sagittal sinus and straight sinus are the two exceptions, which is present within the single meningeal layer of cranial dura, not between industrial and meningeal layer, but just within the meningeal layer, these two are present. Otherwise, all the rest of the cranial dura are present between the industrial and meningeal layer of cranial dura. Okay, so what actually is this vessel, type of blood vessel, which is lined by, which has three layers: inner intima, tunica intima, tunica media, and tunica externa. Is what we studied about the histological section of blood vessel, isn't it? So what is the difference between this venous sinus and vein? Okay, there is no such muscular layer and all that. So this dural venous sinus is lined only by endothelium without any muscular wall. Okay, and it is totally valveless. There is no wall present within this dural venous sinuses. So this is one of the difference from the normal vein of rest of the body. When this dura or dural venous sinuses can be classified on pure sinuses. Okay. So some of the cranial dural venous sinuses are unpaired while some of them are paired. So to enlist the unpaired dural sinuses, superior sagittal sinus, inferior sinus, straight sinus, occipital sinuses we'll be talking about individually. So let's start first with the unpaired sinuses. It is superior sagittal sinus. As we can see here in this section, the right half of the vault of skull has been removed here. So we can see this dural modification and different dural venous sinuses. Okay, so here I am pointing of dura. What is this? What is this which I am pointing? What is this? This caution? Okay, it is falx cerebri, which is present between two cerebral hemispheres. Okay, so this superior sagittal sinus is present along the superior attached margin of this falx cerebri. Okay, it is present along the upper attached margin of falx cerebri, which begins at crista galli, where the anterior attachment of falx cerebri is within the crista galli, which is a bony projection of the ethmoid bone. Okay, so it begins right from the crista galli present within the upper attached margin of falx cerebri, and it ends into the internal occipital protuberance, which corresponds externally with the external occipital protuberance. Okay, you have studied already about the external occipital protuberance. Just interior to that, internal occipital protuberance is there, and this superior sagittal sinus begins from the crista galli to the internal occipital protuberance. And at this internal occipital, at the level of internal occipital protuberance, it continues as the right transverse sinus. Okay. sinuses like this superior sagittal sinus, straight sinus, transverse right and left transverse sinus, all of them are converged at confluence of sinus, also sometimes referred to as trochlear urethra. Okay, so this confluence of sinus is present on the right side of internal occipital protuberance, where all these sinuses comes and meet together, or the sinus present on the right side of the internal occipital protuberance. Okay, and then talking about the now it is suprasocietal sinus. It is one of the kind of type of vein. Okay, so we should know about the sinus. So within the suprasocietal sinus, superior cerebral vein, diploid vein, and emissary vein joins it. You can see here this is suprasocietal sinus once again beginning from the Kushta galli up to the internal occipital protuberance. Okay, and can you see the tributaries? These are the superior cerebral vein which joins it to the suprasocietal sinus. Beside the about emissary vein which connect the veins of the scalp, extracranial vein of the scalp with the intracranial superior sagittal sinus. This is emissary vein is the next diploid vein. You can see here once again, this is the coronal section through the scalp, skull, and here this is superior sagittal sinus, which is almost triangular in shape. Okay, and this superior sagittal sinus is receiving the tributaries as emissary vein. Here, superior cerebral vein, which is present within the soft arachnoid space. Okay, cerebral vein is draining, this emissary vein is draining, and diploid vein is draining. The vein which drains the spongy bone of the skull. Okay, the diploid vein which drains the cancellous part of the skull known as diploid, so it is named as diploid vein. Where this soft arachnoid, or actually it is a villi projecting from the soft arachnoid space into the superior sagittal sinus, because the CSF finally drains into the superior sagittal sinus. Okay, finally drains into the superior sagittal sinus through these arachnoid granulation. Okay. So remember about this arachnoid granulation, which is also projecting into the superior sagittal sinus. To know some detail about the diploid vein, what actually is diploid vein is, it is intraosseous vein which is present within the cancellous bone of the skull, and this cancellous bone or cancellous part of the skull is known as diploid, and the vein which drains this diploid is known as diploid vein. Okay, and there are in total four main diploid vein, which arises from the frontal bone, frontal diploid vein, anterior temporal diploid vein, posterior temporal diploid vein, and occipital diploid vein. Okay, so four main group of diploid vein are present, and the function of the diploid vein is to drain the blood from cranial bones to the mainly to the superior sagittal sinus. It's like both intracranial and extracranial vein. Okay, so this is about the diploid vein, and it is one of the tributaries of superior sagittal sinus. I hope you people are clear. Then the next unpaired sinus is inferior sagittal sinus. Now once again, let's see here. Here the left part of the wall has been removed out. So we can see here, this is superior sagittal sinus and its tributaries diploid vein, superior cerebral vein, emissary vein, all of them are there. Is superior sagittal sinus here at the inferior margin of falx cerebri. This is falx cerebri, and towards the inferior margin, particularly posterior to third part of lower free margin of falx cerebri, is the location of the inferior sagittal sinus. Okay, and it is one of the exception, as we have talked about the rhythm fold of the meningeal layer of cranial dura only. Okay, this is inferior sagittal sinus, which terminates by joining or draining into the straight sinus. Okay, this हेलो अड्किएर आएको छ ल उसो भए एकछिन म क्लास लेक्चर हलमै जान्छु उसो भए 5 मिनट्स वेट गर्नु है त हेलो आमा audible छ
Yes, ma'am.
अहिले कस्तो आइरहेछ अहिले कस्तो आइरहेछ
Clear, sir.
क्लियर छ ओके ल कहाँसम्म सुन्यो त अघि कुन साइनससम्म पुग्यो
Inferior sagittal sinus.
हजुर इन्फेरियर सजाइटल साइनस ओके यहीबाट स्टार्ट गरौँ है त उसो भए इन्फेरियर सुपर सजाइटल साइनस क्लियर भयो okay then inferior sagittal sinus is present at the low free margin of falx cerebri okay low free margin of falx cerebri particularly posterior two-third of low free margin of falx cerebrum present and it is parallelly present with the suprasagittal sinus okay and one of the exception of this intersagittal sinus is as we have talked earlier also almost all the dural venous sinuses are present between the endosteal layer and meningeal layer of cranial dura okay but this inferior sagittal sinus and straight sinus are the two exceptions which is present within the fold of meningeal layer of cranial dura okay there is no endosteal layer, just fold of cranial, fold of meningeal layer of cranial dura within is the presence of this infrasagittal sinus and superior straight sinus. ठीक the domination of this infrasagittal sinus is it dominate by joining with the straight sinus or straight sinus actually is formed by uniting infrasagittal sinus with the one of the cerebral vein known as great cerebral vein of Galen. Then, straight sinus is formed by union of infrasagittal sinus and great cerebral vein. This is infrasagittal sinus and great cerebral vein when unite. Great cerebral vein when unite to form it forms the straight sinus. Okay. And the straight sinus finally dominates into the left transverse sinus. If you remember, superior sagittal sinus dominates into the right transverse sinus, while straight sinus dominates into the left transverse sinus. Okay, and the straight sinus is present within the junction of these falx cerebri and tentorium cerebri. The at the point this falx cerebri unite with the tentorium cerebri. isn't it? So the straight sinus is present at the junction between falx cerebri and tentorium cerebelli. Talking about the tributaries of straight sinus, inferior sagittal sinus and great cerebral vein of Galen are the formative tributaries. Okay, plus superior cerebral vein also drains. Superior cerebellar vein also drains within the straight sinus. So this is about the tributaries, formation, and domination of this straight sinus. Then next on paired dual venous sinus is occipital sinus. This occipital sinus, which begins at the posterior margin of foramen. Can you see in this picture, the whole of the vault of skull has been removed out, so we can see the interior of the skull with different dual venous sinuses. Here, this largest foramen of the skull, what is this foramen known as? Largest foramen of the skull, through which this lower end of medulla oblongata or the spinal cord passes, is the foramen magnum. Okay, so from the posterior end of foramen magnum, a small dural venous sinus begins, which is known as occipital sinus. And this occipital sinus is present along the attached margin of falx cerebelli. Remember, this occipital sinus is present or located along the attached margin of falx cerebelli. Falx cerebelli, which separates the two cerebellar hemisphere. Okay, so this is the location, or this is the attached location of attached margin of falx cerebri where occipital sinus is present. And finally, this occipital sinus drains into the confluence of sinus, which is present just to the right of the internal occipital protuberance. Okay, occipital sinus drains into the confluence of sinus. There. The next unpaired dual venous sinuses are anterior and posterior intercavernous sinus. So among all the dual venous sinus that we are going to study, this cavernous sinus is the most significant one. Okay, from your examination point of view as well as from clinical point of view. So this cavernous sinus is important, and this pure cavernous sinus actually is connected. The two-side cavernous sinus is connected with each other by a pair by anterior intercavernous sinus and posterior intercavernous sinus. Okay, so this anterior and posterior intercavernous sinus passes through the anterior and posterior aspect of diaphragmus heli. Okay, diaphragmus heli, which forms the roof within the roof of the hypophyseal fossa. This is also one of the cranial modification of cranial dura. So within the anterior and posterior aspect of diaphragmus heli, this anterior intercavernous sinus and posterior intercavernous sinus are present, which are unpaired. Okay, one anterior and one posterior intercavernous sinus are present, which transfers along the anterior and posterior margin of diaphragmus heli, and it connects the cavernous sinus of two sides. Okay, this is about the intercavernous sinus. The next unpaired one is the basilar venous plexus. Once again, here the vault of the skull has been removed. Okay, and this largest foramen within the interior of the skull is foramen magnum, and just in front of foramen magnum, a sloping part of the sphenoid bone is present. Sphenoid bone and the occipital bone is present, which is known as clavus. Okay, this part is the clavus, and within this clavus, a plexus of vein is present, known as basilar venous plexus. Okay, basilar venous plexus, and this basilar venous plexus is connected bilaterally with the inferior petrosal sinus. This is inferior petrosal sinus, which is connected bilaterally with this basilar venous plexus. So this makes the total of the unpaired sinus. Just to recall, the unpaired sinus are superior sagittal sinus, inferior sagittal sinus, straight sinus. Okay, and then occipital sinus, anterior posterior intercavernous sinus, basilar, finally basilar venous plexus. These are the unpaired dural venous sinuses. Now then we are going to study about the paired dural venous sinuses. Shall we proceed? Am I audible?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, then we'll go for the paired sinus, and let's begin from the transverse sinus. Now, here once again, this is the internal occipital protuberance. Just to the right of internal occipital protuberance, this is the confluence of sinus. Okay. Now, from the confluence of sinus, on the right side, right transverse sinus begins, and on the left side, left transverse sinus begins. Okay. Location-wise, this transverse sinus is present along the posterior attached margin of tentorium cerebelli. This greenish color structure is representing the tentorium cerebelli, isn't it? Which separates the occipital lobe of the cerebrum with the cerebellum below. So this tentorium cerebelli, the posterior attached margin of tentorium cerebelli is the location of transverse sinus. And this transverse sinus continues anteriorly as the sigmoid sinus. Transverse sinus, when we trace anteriorly, it continues down as the sigmoid sinus. Or we can say transverse sinus terminate being continuous as the sigmoid sinus. While transverse sinus receives the superior sagittal, right transverse sinus receives superior sagittal sinus, left transverse sinus receives straight sinus into it. Okay, isn't it? When we studied about the superior sagittal sinus, it drains into the right transverse sinus, and straight sinus drains into the left transverse sinus. Okay, talking about the extent of the transverse sinus, it extends from the internal occipital protuberance to the mastoid angle of parietal bone. A parietal bone, the posterior inferior angle of parietal bone, which is articulating with the mastoid bone, is considered as mastoid angle of parietal bone. So, right from the internal occipital protuberance up to the mastoid angle of parietal bone is the extent of transverse sinus. Okay, so as it is present on either side, it is the pure sinus, transverse sinus. The next is sigmoid sinus. Now here we are tracing the transverse sinus anteriorly, and from the mastoid angle of parietal bone, this transverse sinus attain a sigmoid shape or S shape. Roughly it is S shape. Now this S or sigmoid shape sinus is known as sigmoid sinus. Okay, sigmoid sinus, which is the continuation of transverse sinus, and it dominates into the or it become continuous as the internal jugular vein. Remember, sigmoid sinus continues down as the internal jugular vein, which is one of the largest vein of the neck, isn't it? And tributaries of sigmoid sinus is mastoid emissary vein, which communicate posterior auricular vein with the sigmoid sinus. Where we know about the emissary vein, which connect the vein of the scalp with the or the extracranial vein with the intracranial vein. So here, this mastoid emissary vein communicate the sigmoid sinus with the posterior auricular vein. While the next is cerebellar vein and labyrinthine vein. Cerebellar vein from the cerebellar hemisphere and labyrinthine vein from the middle ear cavity also drains into the sigmoid sinus. These are the tributaries of sigmoid sinus. Okay. So the next, just to recall here, we have talked about the right transverse sinus and left transverse sinus. Okay, so this right and left transverse sinus, once again, right transverse sinus is the continuation of superior sagittal sinus. Okay, superior sagittal sinus continues or drains into the right transverse sinus, while the straight sinus drains into the left transverse sinus, which is more clear in this diagram, isn't it? Then this left transverse sinus continues as the sigmoid, left sigmoid sinus. Right transverse sinus also continues down as the right sigmoid sinus. Sigmoid sinus finally become continuous as the internal jugular vein. Say sigmoid sinus which become continuous as first at the beginning of internal jugular vein, there is a bulbous expansion known as superior bulb of the internal jugular vein. Okay, so the superior bulb of the internal jugular vein now become continuous as the internal jugular vein, which drains, which pass down and deep into the neck. This is about the beginning and termination of sigmoid sinus, which is the pure sinus. The next one and the most important one among the developing sinus is cavernous sinus. Here, this cavernous sinus, this one is the cavernous sinus. Cavernous sinus is located on either side of the middle cranial fossa, on either side of the body of the sphenoid bone. This is body of the sphenoid bone, okay? On both sides of the body of the sphenoid bone, this is the cavernous sinus. And this cavernous sinus, when we look at the interior of the cavernous sinus, it is divided into numbers of small caves by the septa arising from the endothelium itself. So as those small caves or it appears like a cave, it is given the name cavernous sinus. Okay, it is divided into numbers of small compartments. And this cavernous sinus is formed between two layers of dura. The roof and lateral wall is formed by the interosseous layer, while the meningeal layer, while the floor and medial wall is formed by the interosseous layer of dura mater, cranial dura mater. And talking about the extent of this cavernous sinus, it extends right from the superior orbital fissure anteriorly to the apex of petrous part of temporal bone. So let's see here, this is the interior. We have not studied about interior of the skull yet, okay? I think in the next bone demo, you will be having interior of the skull. Here, this is the anterior cranial fossa, this is middle cranial fossa, and this is posterior cranial fossa, okay? And here, this is superior orbital fissure, and within middle cranial fossa, this large pyramidal set bone is known as petrous part of the temporal bone, and its apex is directed anterior. So talking about the extent of this cavernous sinus, it extends right from the superior orbital fissures anteriorly to the apex of the petrous part of temporal bone posteriorly. This is the anterior posterior limit or extent of the cavernous sinus. Measurement wise, it measures about 2 centimeter in length and about 1 centimeter in breadth. Okay, length is about 2 centimeter and breadth is about 1 centimeter above the cavernous sinus. We can see in this picture, this is coronal section through the middle cranial fossa at the level of cavernous sinus. This is pituitary gland lodged within the hypophyseal fossa on the body of the sphenoid bone, where we can see this paired sphenoidal ear sinus within the body of the sphenoid. Okay, so on either side of the body of the sphenoid, this is cavernous sinus present, and as we have already talked about, it consists of numbers of small numbers of compartment or caves of the blood vessel. It is named as cavernous sinus, and it has got its lateral wall and roof. Okay, so this lateral wall and roof of the cavernous sinus is formed by meningeal layer of cranial dura, while floor and medial wall is formed by interosseous layer of cranial dura. And it is obvious as this floor and medial wall is related with the body of the sphincter, or it is related with the bone, so obviously it is lined by interosseous layer of cranial dura, while lateral wall and roof is lined by meningeal layer of the cranial dura. Okay, and we should know about the structure passing through the cavernous sinus. So numbers of structure passes through this cavernous sinus. One of the important one being this internal cavity artery. This is one of the most important artery which supplies the brain. Okay, internal carotid artery, and just inferior lateral to internal carotid artery, this nerve is known as abduction. So towards the floor, internal carotid artery and abducent nerve passes through the cavernous sinus, and on the lateral wall, it is pierced or it is traversed through by 4 different nerves. Okay, third cranial nerve, oculomotor nerve, fourth cranial nerve, that is trochlear nerve, and then the 2 division of fifth cranial nerve, that is ophthalmic division of fifth cranial nerve and maxillary division of fifth cranial nerve. So these are the 4 nerves which passes through the lateral wall of the cavernous sinus. Okay, third, fourth, and fifth, 2 division of fifth. Remember, oculomotor, trochlear, ophthalmic, and maxillary division of the trigeminal nerve. These 4 nerves traverse through the lateral wall of the cavernous sinus, while internal carotid artery and inferior lateral to that abducent nerve travels through the cavernous sinus towards its floor. Okay, remember this structure passing through the cavernous sinus is important. Actually, whole of the cavernous sinus is important for you people. Then we'll talk about the relation of the cavernous sinus. So once again, to get oriented with this picture, this is coronal section through the middle cranial fossa at the level of cavernous sinus. Okay, here we can see pituitary gland. Okay, above the pituitary gland, this is optic chiasma. Now, superior relation of this cavernous sinus, it's superiorly it is related with optic chiasma and internal carotid artery. Okay, this is internal carotid artery. And then medially, medial relation of cavernous sinus is medially it is related with pituitary gland and sphenoidal ear sinus, isn't it? Cavernous sinus here, this is medial wall of the cavernous sinus, and it is related with pituitary gland as well as sphenoidal ear sinus. While laterally, it is related with the oncus of the temporal lobe of cerebrum. Okay, oncus of the temporal lobe of cerebrum as well as cavum trigeminal, where the trigeminal ganglion is lost. Okay, laterally it is related with the oncus of the temporal lobe as well as cavum trigeminal, which lost the trigeminal ganglion. While inferiorly it is related with foramen lacerum. Now remember, when you study about the interior of the skull, you be attentive to know where this foramen lacerum is present. Okay, so foramen lacerum is the inferior relation of cavernous sinus. Medial relation is pituitary gland and sphenoidal ear sinus. Superior relation is of the chiasma and internal carotid artery. Lateral relation is concourse of the temporal lobe as well as cavum trigeminal, which lowers the trigeminal gap. Are you people listening? Are you people there? Are you there?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so here once again the same picture, and you must be confused like internal carotid artery is traversing through the cavernous sinus towards the floor, but then how it become relation superior relation is. So see here, this internal carotid artery actually is coming passing out through the base of the skull to the interior of the skull. Okay, through there is one internal carotid canal is there. Through the carotid canal from the exterior of the skull, the internal carotid artery enters intracranial, and it has a curvy path. Okay, firstly it turn forward, upward and forward, and traverse through the cavernous sinus. Okay, and just in front of the cavernous sinus it further turn upward and backward. So during the course of this upward second turn, during course of its upward and backward movement, this cavernous sinus is related with the internal carotid artery superior. Okay, so don't get confused how the internal carotid artery is related superiorly as well as within the transverse within the cavernous sinus. Then this is the cavernous sinus which we were talking about. Just to recall, cavernous sinus is extending anteriorly from superior orbital fissure posteriorly to the apex of the petrous part of temporal bone, which measures about 2 centimeter in length and 1 centimeter in diameter. Okay. And then these two cavernous sinus are interconnected with each other by oncodural venous sinus, that is anterior intercavernous sinus and posterior intercavernous sinus, okay, which is present within the anterior and posterior margin of diaphragm cell. Then we should know about the tributaries or different vein draining into the cavernous sinus. Okay, so this cavernous sinus receive venous blood from eye, meninges, as well as cerebrum itself. Okay, so from the eye, the vein draining into cavernous sinus is superior ophthalmic vein, inferior ophthalmic vein, and central vein of retina. Okay, central vein of retina, superior and inferior ophthalmic vein drains directly into the cavernous sinus. While from the meninges, the vein draining into cavernous sinus is medial meningeal sinus as well as sphenoparietal sinus. Okay, the sphenoparietal sinus and medial meningeal sinus also drains into the cavernous sinus from the meninges. And from the cerebrum, superficial middle cerebral vein and inferior cerebral vein are the vein which drain from cerebrum into the cavernous sinus. Okay, remember, people need to know about the extent of the cavernous sinus, relation of the cavernous sinus, as well as tributaries and even the communication of the cavernous sinus. So while this cavernous sinus drains into the transverse sinus through the superior petrosal sinus and into the internal jugular vein through the inferior petrosal sinus. Okay, the superior and inferior petrosal sinus are also the paired sinus, which we are coming up in next slides, coming slide. Okay, remember, cavernous sinus finally drains into the transverse sinus through the superior petrosal sinus and internal jugular vein or the superior valve of internal jugular vein through the inferior petrosal sinus. These two are the drainage of cavernous sinus, and these remaining are the tributaries of the cavernous sinus. This cavernous sinus has where it communicates. It has different communication. Okay, cavernous sinus is communicating with the pterygoid venous plexus. Pterygoid venous plexus, which is present within the intratemporal fossa, where we have studied about the pterygoid muscle, medial and lateral pterygoid muscle. So beneath those muscle, pterygoid venous plexus is present, and this pterygoid venous plexus is intercommunicating with this cavernous sinus through the emissary vein passing through the foramen oval and foramen spinosum. Okay, foramen oval and foramen spinosum give transmission to emissary vein, which connect pterygoid venous plexus with the cavernous sinus. Besides, this facial vein is also communicating with the cavernous sinus directly through the superior ophthalmic vein. Okay, so, and anterior posterior intercavernous sinus communicate the cavernous sinus of two sides. We know about the communication of this sinus just to know how the infection, if happens in one of the cavernous sinus or infection happen in facial vein, how it is transmitted to the cavernous sinus and from one cavernous sinus to another. Okay, that is important for the clinical, let's say. Just to recall here, this is the cavernous sinus, schematic diagram of cavernous sinus. Okay, talking about the tributaries. Tributaries is from the orbit is supraophthalmic vein, infraophthalmic vein, and central vein. While from the meninges, venoparietal sinus, middle meningeal vein, and from the brain, from the cerebrum itself, superficial middle cerebral vein and inferior cerebral vein are the tributaries. Okay, these are in total seven tributaries, while cavernous sinus drains into this transverse sinus through the superior petrosal sinus and into the internal jugular vein through the inferior petrosal sinus. Okay, then talking about the communication, cavernous sinus is communicating with the pterygoid venous plexus through the emissary vein passing through foramen ovale and foramen spinous. Okay, while facial vein is communicating with the cavernous sinus through this superior ophthalmic vein, also through the pterygoid venous plexus in the form of the facial vein into the facial vein. Okay, and cavernous sinus is also connected with this basilar venous plexus. Okay, so these are different communication tributaries and drainage of this cavernous sinus. The next one is the superior petrosal sinus. Now this is petrous part of the temporal bone. Okay, the petrous part of the temporal bone has got its anterior border, superior border, and inferior border. So along the superior border of petrous part of the temporal bone, superior petrosal sinus is present, which is present along the anterolateral attached margin of this tentorium cerebelli. This is tentorium cerebelli. Okay, along the posterior attached margin, transverse sinus is present, while along the anterolateral attached margin of tentorium cerebelli, the superior sagittal sinus is present on either side. So it is pure sinus, superior sagittal sinus. And the suprasagittal sinus drains the venous blood from cavernous sinus into the transverse sinus. Okay, so we have talked about the location. It is present along the superior border of it, petrous part of temporal bone, along with the anterolateral attached margin of tentorium cerebelli, while it drains the blood from the cavernous sinus into the transverse sinus on its corresponding transverse sinus. Next is the inferior petrosal sinus. Now, this is superior petrosal sinus draining the blood from the cavernous sinus into the transverse sinus on both sides, while this one is the inferior petrosal sinus, which is present along the inferior border of petrous part of the this pyramidal shape bone is petrous part of temporal bone. Okay, so along the inferior border of petrous part of temporal bone, this inferior petrosal sinus is present, and inferior petrosal sinus drains the cavernous sinus into the internal jugular vein. Remember, this internal jugular vein, first tributary of internal jugular vein is inferior petrosal sinus. Okay, inferior petrosal sinus, which is the first tributary of internal jugular vein. Next is sphenoparietal sinus. So, sphenoparietal sinus, which is one of the tributary of cavernous sinus, draining the blood from the meninges. Sphenoparietal sinus is located at the undersurface of posterior border of lesser ring of sphenoid bone. This sphenoid bone forms the larger part of middle cranial fossa. This large part is the greater wing of the sphenoid bone, while the small part is the lesser wing of the sphenoid bone. Okay? So exactly beneath, underneath the lesser wing of sphenoid bone, the sphenoparietal sinus is present, and it is drained into the cavernous sinus. Okay, it is one of the tributary of cavernous sinus. This is about the sphenoparietal sinus. Then finally, we are done with all the beard and on-beard sinuses. Okay, I hope you people are clear about all this. Then finally, the venous sinus is related with dural fold. As now, we have studied both about the dural venous sinus as well as the folds of the cranial dura. Now, this falx cerebri and the dural venous sinus related within this falx cerebri are superior sagittal sinus, inferior sagittal sinus, as well as straight sinus. Straight sinus is as it is present between the junction of falx cerebri and tentorium cerebelli. So this straight sinus is related with both of them. Okay. Then next, within the falx cerebelli. So within the falx cerebelli, which dural venous sinus is related with the posterior attached margin of falx cerebelli? Do you remember? the unpaired venous sinus, occipital sinus is related with the posterior attached margin of falx cerebelli. Okay, and with the tentorium cerebelli, the transverse sinus as well as superior petrosal sinus. Plus, even we can consider the straight sinus also is related with the tentorium cerebelli. Okay, transverse sinus, superior petrosal sinus, and then straight sinus are related with tentorium cerebelli. While along with diaphragm ocella. Now, without looking at this, along with diaphragm ocella, tell me which dural venous sinuses are related with diaphragm ocella. At least one of you speak out along with the diaphragm ocella, which dural venous sinus is related.
Anterior and posterior intercavernous.
Anterior and posterior intercavernous sinus are related with the diaphragm ocella. Okay. So this is all about the dural venous sinuses, and historical we have talked about the paired and unpaired dural venous sinuses. Okay, within the unpaired we have studied about the superior sagittal sinus, inferior sagittal sinus, superior sagittal sinus which drains into the right transverse sinus, inferior sagittal sinus which drains into the straight sinus, which is actually formed by the union of straight sinus with the great cerebral vein of Galen. Okay, then the straight sinus drains into the left transverse sinus. Then the next unpaired sinus is occipital sinus attached along the posterior margin of falx cerebelli. Talking about the paired sinus, we have started with this transverse sinus. Okay, transverse sinus become continuous into the sigmoid sinus. Then cavernous sinus on either side of the body of the sphenoid. Cavernous sinus drains into the transverse sinus through the superior petrosal sinus, while into the internal jugular vein through the inferior petrosal sinus, which are also the paired sinuses. Okay, sphenoparietal sinus. This one is the sphenoparietal sinus, which is present underneath the left wing of the sphenoid bone. And within the cavernous sinus, you should be clear about the relation of the cavernous sinus, extent of the cavernous sinus, tributaries, communication, and its drainage. Okay. Once again, I repeat, cavernous sinus is very, very important for you people with the examination point of view as well as clinical aspect. Okay. So let's go for some of the clinical aspects related with this dural venous sinus. So thrombosis of suprasagittal sinus may occur due to spread of infection from nose, scalp, and diploid tissue. Because we know these are all the tributaries of suprasagittal sinus. So infection occurs in any of the vein, it may reach into the suprasagittal sinus. While thrombosis of sigmoid sinus may occur from infection of middle ear, external which extend to the suprasagittal sinus. Sigmoid sinus which drains the labyrinthine vein, isn't it? Which is arising from the middle ear cavity. If middle ear cavity is infected, it may result in thrombosis of sigmoid sinus, and from sigmoid sinus, it may even extend up to the superior sagittal sinus. While septic thrombosis of cavernous sinus, okay, as we have mentioned, it is one of the most clinically significant cavernous sinus, dural venous sinus. Septic thrombosis of cavernous sinus, which is most common from the danger area of face, okay, orbit, and pharynx, leads to severe pain in eye, resulting in ophthalmoplegia, even the edema of eyelid, okay, resulting in exophthalmos condition with the bulging out of the eye. And one infection of one cavernous sinus may automatically spreads into the next cavernous sinus through the intercommunication anterior and posterior cavernous sinus. So what actually is this danger area of face? This is the area where we put in marks. Okay, marks area or dangerous area of face. From here, the pterygoid venous plexus, which drains this area of face, is directly related with the cavernous sinus. So infection or any of the lesion here from the danger area of face may directly spread the infection into the cavernous sinus, and which is very, very serious condition. Okay, that's why thrombosis this particular area of face is considered as the dangerous area of face, as it is directly related with the cavernous sinus. Then, if venous carotid artery is ruptured, it leads to arteriovenous communication, because now we know cavernous sinus, the structure passing through the cavernous sinus is internal carotid artery. If it ruptures within it, there may be the communication between artery and vein, and that leads to pulsating exophthalmos, edema of eyelid, or ophthalmoplegia. While middle meningeal vein, mostly the cranial veins are related, cranial veins are superficial than the artery. So this middle meningeal vein, which are more closer to the bone than arteries, are more prone to torn during any skull fracture. The blood vessels, middle meningeal vein is most commonly torn out and causing extradural hemorrhages. Okay, remember, veins are more closer to skull than the arteries, so these veins are more commonly torn out during any skull fracture. So these are some of the applied aspects related to this dural venous sinus. I think we are done for today. Any confusion? Any part do I need to repeat? Do I need to repeat any part of this? So then we'll end the class for today. Thank you for your attention. And please remember, tomorrow we are going to have anatomy class at 12 to 1. Okay?